Okay, now that we've covered some of those things about what the Bible says about the flood, the great flood of Noah, we're going to really explore why there was this change from a biblical perspective as far as understanding the Bible and going with what the Bible says, and what really started that process of uh, trying to interject millions of years or to say that it was actually a longer period of time than what the Bible indicates. And that really starts with an idea that is called uniformitarianism. And that's the name of it. This is going to sound very similar to one of our the principle of uniformity that we talked about earlier as well. And the principle of uniformity, remember we said, was a mostly reasonable idea. Looking at processes today and saying, oh, hey, that probably happened that way throughout history. Ice freezing at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, for instance. Uniformitarianism takes it to an extreme. And this is the idea that all processes, every natural process has been operating in the same manner at the same rate throughout the Earth's history. Now, remember when we talked about the principle of uniformity, we said that, like I said, it was mostly reasonable that those processes, some of the processes that we looked at, it's a reasonable idea to look back in history and say that's probably happened always in that same manner. However, some processes, well, we really don't know because they're a little bit more complex. There's more factors involved, and the addition or subtraction of some of those factors can affect it. And the example we gave then was when ice freezes, it always cracks a rock and breaks off certain chunks. Well, that depends on how fast it freezes, depends on the nature of the rock, it depends on how much water is present in the crack, and a couple other elements there as well. So uniformitarianism takes that principle of uniformity to an extreme. And yeah, here we go. The idea of uniformitarianism was popularized by a man named Charles Lyell. He is considered the father of modern geology, and that should be modern, M-O-D-E-R-N, not M-A. However, there's some problems with that. Like I said, some of these processes require multiple factors, and the addition or subtraction of these factors would necessarily affect the process and the rate at which the process happens. For instance, we know that there is localized flooding. We see flooding every year. And this localized flooding has certain effects, and there are certain things that cause it. How much water is present to begin with? How much water is coming down, either through precipitation or through snow melt or ice melt? And those things will affect it. Is there a new beaver dam? I mean, there are certain things that will affect this. And we know that there are both really slow mechanisms for some of these to happen, and we know that there are times when it can happen really fast, again, depending on the factors involved at that time, or even be more widespread depending on the factors involved. Yeah, like I said, Charles Lyell took this idea of uniformitarianism, popularized it, and pretty much said that there was no worldwide flood. If we look at the processes we know today, we don't see that happening. Therefore, it didn't happen in the past, and it must be localized floods, maybe many of them over a long period of time. The natural processes seen today have not always proceeded at the same rate or on the same scale as in the past. That's one of the problems with taking the principle of uniformity to the extreme here with uniformitarianism. So, Charles Lyell really didn't explore this particular idea. Let's see. As a result of this taking a longer period of time, there was no giant flood. It's a series of much smaller floods. If it was a series of much smaller floods, then it would need to take an extreme amount of time because we know there's a lot of deposition. Floods only deposit a little bit every time. So therefore, in order to get a couple 100 feet of strata of deposited sediment, then it would necessarily require millions, if not billions of years in some locations to accumulate. So that was a problem in Lyell's time, simply because they really didn't have any idea, any way of calculating how old the Earth is, and the Bible indicated that the Earth was not millions of years old. So he really interjected this idea of long periods of geologic time, and popularized it. You see in the background there, and we've seen the cover of this book before, it's Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And it was in this book that he really popularized, or he really emphasized this idea of uniformitarianism. And Charles Darwin was influenced by Lyell's ideas. We do know that Charles Darwin took a copy of Principles of Geology with him on the voyage that he took around South America a lot, down into the Galapagos Islands and other places, where he really formulated his idea of scientific evolution. I am going to be specific that way because the generic idea of evolution has been around for a long time. Charles Darwin really combined it with the study of science and observation, and thereby gave it a little bit more credibility. And we'll talk more about that when we get, actually probably in the next little bit after this lesson. We'll talk about Charles Darwin a little bit more in depth. Oh, something happened there. There we go. The opposite idea of uniformitarianism in general is the idea of catastrophism. And this is a generic thing. You don't have to be a Christian to believe in catastrophism. This is kind of like that idea of intelligence design. You don't have to be a Christian because it doesn't necessarily involve God. Now it can. A Christian could easily go into the idea of catastrophism, because catastrophism is the idea that one or more catastrophes are primarily responsible for Earth's geological features. If you only believe there was one catastrophism, it's not much of a stretch to believe that it's the flood of the Bible, and that would necessarily involve a belief in God and what the Bible says. However, there are non-Christians who, as they looked at the geologic record, realized that it's in their minds that it was a series of catastrophes causing this, what they saw, not normal processes working over a long period of time. Georges Cuvier was the first to suggest the idea of many catastrophes. Cuvier was more known for his studies on animal anatomy. However, he did expand those studies into geography again, or geology. Again, in the past, science wasn't neatly categorized the way we kind of have it now, where we have botany and we have zoology and human anatomy and physiology, geology, paleogeology, or paleontology, and so on. A lot of the scientists in the past really looked at several different areas, and Georges Cuvier was one of those. But yeah, he was among the first to say that there was a series of catastrophes. He believed that the Earth had experienced many catastrophes, and that the last catastrophe was Noah's flood, that there were catastrophes before Noah's flood. So he was really the first to write this idea down and suggest it. And this idea really struck a chord with a lot of Bible-believing folks, because he did include the idea of Noah's flood, saying that it was the last catastrophe, probably the worst catastrophe out of the whole list too. And then as some geologists in more modern times were looking at the Earth and what they were seeing in the Earth, they saw evidence of catastrophes. Now, they ignored the idea of the Genesis flood, because in their minds, that is religion, and we can't be using religion to understand science. So they totally reject that idea, but what they see does indicate catastrophe. So because they reject a worldwide flood for two reasons. One, they don't believe the Bible. Two, we've never seen it in our lifetimes. So since science is based on observation, they kind of throw that one out there as well. And they say, we do see evidence of catastrophes, and it's probably a series of catastrophes. Volcanoes at one time, massive flooding in another. You might hear about, I forget what it's called, but there was an ice dam in Montana millions of years ago, and that ice dam broke, causing a major catastrophic flooding event over many areas in the northwestern United States there. And so because they see evidence of that. In more modern times, many scientists refer to a new hypothesis as neo-catastrophism. This is uniformitarianism with the occasional catastrophe. So basically they say that these processes happen normally over long periods of time, but every now and then we get a serious catastrophe that really affects everything. Not on the scale of a worldwide flood, but on a much larger scale than normal localized processes would be. And that, I believe, is actually the end of this particular section. Your science video question will be this, and the answer is Wile E. Coyote is a super genius. Once again, that's Wile E. Coyote is a super genius. So go to the Earth Science video question and make sure you answer that. Don't forget to put my name is, whatever your name is, and then Wile E. Coyote is a super genius.